The only witness knew everything and said nothing. Welcome to Cafe Echoes. I am your host, Silas Graves. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from today. I appreciate every one of you. Now, the mystery begins. Sir Alistair Wynne, broad-shouldered, florid, and heavily assured in his opinions, had been in excellent humour that evening. He possessed that dangerous species of geniality which often conceals a habit of command. His laugh rolled out too loudly. His hand descended too heartily upon the shoulder of the person he addressed, and even his compliments seemed to establish a debt. Yet there was no denying that he dominated the room. One felt in him the force of a man who had spent 30 years arranging the destinies of others, and had come to suppose that Providence itself moved most sensibly when it agreed with him. And at his right sat Miss Viola Trent, the actress, dark-eyed, amused, and with a voice so beautifully controlled that even trivialities acquired the air of epigrams. She had returned from the continent only 3 days earlier, and it was said that Sir Alistair had invested more than money in a theatrical venture with which her name was connected. Opposite her was Mr. Adrian Lee, the young politician, smooth-faced and elegant, whose public speeches on moral reconstruction had already begun to make him useful to newspapers and impossible at private dinners. Beside him sat Miss Eleanor Wynne, Sir Alistair's niece, a girl of perhaps 26, slender and fair, who had a habit of listening as if she heard something behind the spoken word. There were others. Colonel Ashby, bronzed, square and soldierly, one who had been a friend of Sir Alistair's since some obscure colonial campaign. Mr. Felix Harman, the private secretary, pale and precise, with rimless spectacles and a talent for becoming part of the furniture when convenience required. Mrs. Daphne Marlowe, Lady Wynne's younger sister, whose beauty was of that soft and fragile kind that encourages underestimation. Dr. Bernard Reeve, a specialist in nervous disorders and a dinner guest of increasing social value. And Mr. Cedric Vale, a collector and connoisseur, exquisitely dressed and faintly insolent, whose admiration for Blackthorn House was only exceeded by his curiosity about what it contained. If there was any discord among them, it did not at first rise above the polished surface of conversation. The talk moved from elections to Paris, from music to market uncertainty, and Sir Alistair boomed, contradicted, and pronounced. Lady Wynne guided the movement with the slightest lifting of an eyebrow. Miss Trent smiled over the rim of her glass. Eleanor Wynne said little. Only once did something occur which might, in another company, have passed wholly unnoticed, but in that room seemed to leave behind it a faint vibration, like the echo of a struck crystal. Mr. Vale, who had been admiring a small enamel snuff-box that stood near Sir Alistair's place, remarked with airy interest, "And the famous Wynne acquisition, is it still hidden from vulgar eyes? Or does one of us enjoy the privilege tonight?" Sir Alistair's expression changed very slightly. It was not a start. The man was too masterful for that. But his joviality tightened. "You refer," he said, "to the Vermeulen." "The same. Unless rumour has embroidered it into something even grander." Colonel Ashby gave a short grunt. Dashed foolish to talk of such things before servants. Sir Alistair waved a hand. "My servants are trustworthy." Mr. Harman, the secretary, lowered his eyes at once. Miss Trent leaned forward. "You cannot introduce mystery and then refuse to satisfy curiosity. What is the Vermeulen?" "A small painting," said Lady Wynne before her husband could answer, "and not nearly so romantic as Cedric would make it." "On the contrary," said Vale, "its romance lies precisely in its size. One can conceal a masterpiece more easily than a cathedral." Sir Alistair smiled, but the smile did not warm him. "There is nothing concealed. The piece is in my possession and well protected. That is enough." "Protected from thieves," said Adrian Lee lightly. Or from experts." That drew laughter, though not from Sir Alistair. "From both," he said. Eleanor Wynne, who had until then remained silent, looked across the table at her uncle and said in a tone so quiet that the others nearly missed it, "And from the rightful owner." There was the briefest pause. Lady Wynne set down her fork. "Eleanor," but Sir Alister had already turned, "I do not understand your meaning." "I think you understand it very well." The room became suddenly attentive. Miss Trent's eyes sharpened. Colonel Ashby shifted in his chair. Harmon went still as paper. "My dear child," said Sir Alister, and now his voice had acquired that genial menace by which older men seek to reduce the young to foolishness. "You have been reading too many sentimental memoirs. The painting was legally purchased." "Legally?" said Eleanor. "Oh, it is not always honestly." A flush rose above Sir Alister's collar. For a moment one expected an explosion. Instead he laughed, a laugh forced out as one may force open a rusted lock. "There speaks youth. It believes that all property descends from heaven with certificates attached. We are not in a nursery, Eleanor." "No," she said. "We are in your house." Lady Wynne intervened then with skill, turning to Dr. Reeve on some question of Vienna and psychoanalysis. And because people of breeding instinctively collaborate in the burial of awkwardness, conversation resumed. Yet the thing had happened. It lay among them like a wire drawn taut beneath a carpet. After dinner, the ladies went to the drawing-room where coffee was served before the fire. The men remained behind over port. Later, some played bridge. Others drifted toward the library, in that long, dark room lined with books and Italian cabinets where Sir Alister kept his rarer objects and liked to hold forth on art with the confidence of a conqueror surveying annexed territory. The weather had turned raw. A damp wind moved in the trees beyond the terrace, and twice the windows gave a faint complaining rattle. Indoors all was warmth and ordered luxury. Yet a peculiar uneasiness had begun to show itself. It was visible not in what was said, but in what could not be said naturally. When Eleanor entered the drawing-room, Lady Wynne looked up at her with an expression that was almost warning. When Miss Trent spoke to Adrian Lee by the fire, both lowered their voices as Harmon passed near them with a tray. Colonel Ashby asked too abruptly for brandy. Cedric Vale, examining a Chinese figure on the mantel, smiled to himself with private amusement. At 10:30, Sir Alister announced that he would show the Vermeulen to those with sufficient intelligence to appreciate it. The invitation was delivered broadly, but with an undernote of challenge. Everyone understood that he meant to wipe away the memory of the dinner-table exchange by an exhibition of possession. He would display the object. He would dominate the room again. There was some movement toward the library. Lady Wynne did not rise immediately. She sat very straight, one hand resting on the arm of her chair. "Must you, Alistair?" she asked. "Certainly." "It is late. All the better. Mystery improves after dinner." No one could refuse without emphasis. They went. The library at Blackthorn House had once been a gallery and retained something of that character, and between the bookshelves hung old portraits, dim and observant. In the farther wall, mostly concealed by a Flemish tapestry, was a narrow steel door set flush into the panelling. Sir Alister crossed to it with a flourish that struck some as theatrical and some as vulgar. "You see," he said, "that I do not leave genius in desk drawers." He drew aside the tapestry, stooped to the combination lock, and began to turn it. As he did so, the room behind him seemed curiously still. The guests stood in a crescent shape beneath the shaded lamps. Their expressions differed, yet all were intent. Vale was openly eager. Miss Trent watched with an actress's concentration. Lee had folded his arms. Eleanor Wynne was very pale. Harmon stood a little apart, his face unreadable. The mechanism clicked. Sir Alister pulled open the door and reached within. Then he stopped. "What the devil?" He bent farther in, his broad back blocking the view. An instant later he drew out not a picture, but an empty velvet frame case. It hung in his hand like a ridiculous object in a nightmare. For one moment, nobody moved. "The painting is gone," said Eleanor. Sir Alister wheeled round. His face had altered so violently that even those who disliked him were shocked. The colour had drained from it. The eyes seemed to thrust forward out of flesh suddenly too loose to contain them. "Gone? Impossible." He strode back to the safe, thrusting aside the frame case, searching within with both hands. Papers, boxes, a leather dispatch wallet, these he dragged out and dropped on a nearby table. No painting appeared. "Who has touched this?" he demanded. No one answered. "Who has touched it?" he repeated louder. Colonel Ashby came forward. "Now see here, when did you last look?" "This afternoon. It was here." "Here." Lady Wynne had risen. "Alistair, lower your voice." "Lower my... Do you understand what this means?" Cedric Vale said softly. "It means, presumably, that your safeguards were not perfect." Sir Alister rounded on him with such violence that for an instant one thought he might strike him. Instead, he gave a kind of choking gasp and clutched at the edge of the table. The empty case fell. His fingers spread against the polished wood. Then, slowly and horribly, the great assured body sagged. Dr. Reeve leapt first, catching him before he hit the floor. The others crowded forward. There were cries, a chair overturned, Lady Wynne's voice cutting through the confusion with terrifying steadiness. "Stand back! Give him air." They laid Sir Alister on the carpet. His head had fallen at an unnatural angle. Dr. Reeve knelt beside him, loosening the collar, pressing fingers to the throat, then to the wrist. The seconds passed with a dreadful distinctness. "Well?" said Lady Wynne. Dr. Reeve looked up. His face had gone grave in a way that made all professional formulas obscene. "I am afraid," he said, "Sir Alister is dead." No one spoke. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the long windows, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispering. And in the doorway, unnoticed at first by all but Eleanor, stood the housemaid who had brought in the coffee tray 10 minutes earlier. She was a slight girl with frightened eyes and white hands clasped hard together at her apron. She stared not at the dead man, nor at the open safe, but at someone in the room. When Eleanor turned sharply to follow the direction of that stare, the girl dropped her gaze at once. "Millie," said Lady Wynne in a voice of iron control, "what are you doing there?" The maid opened her mouth. No sound came. The girl opened her mouth again, and again nothing emerged. Her throat moved convulsively. One hand flew up to it as though some physical obstruction had risen there. The effect was so strange, so at variance with the ordinary habits of service and speech, that for a second the company could only stare. Then Lady Wynne crossed the room with swift authority. "Millie, answer me." The maid's eyes, large and dark with terror, shifted once more toward the circle of guests. It was not the vacant glance of shock, but a fixed and dreadful recognition. She knew something. Of that, and in the first instant, there could be no doubt whatever. Yet whether fear, loyalty, or some more complicated impulse held her silent, no one could tell. Dr. Reeve rose from beside the body. "Do not press her at once. She is in a state of acute distress." Sir Alister lay on the carpet where they had placed him, one arm bent beneath him, the broad, domineering face already assuming the immobility that death lends to the most animated personalities. The contrast between the violent life of the man and the sudden inertness of the thing he had become was unnerving. A few moments earlier, he had commanded the room. Now he had surrendered it entirely. Colonel Ashby muttered an oath under his breath. Lady Wynne did not take her eyes from the maid. "Did you see something?" Millie's lips trembled. She made a desperate effort to speak, and only a faint breath escaped her. Then she shook her head violently, too violently for denial to be convincing. "She cannot get the words out," said Eleanor Wynne quietly. She had come nearer, but unlike the others, she did not crowd the girl. "You are frightening her." "I?" said Lady Wynne, with a turn of the head almost serpentine in its restraint. Miss Trent spoke then, her low voice unexpectedly gentle. "Let the poor child sit down." Millie seemed on the verge of collapse. Harmon, moving at last from his discreet corner, fetched a chair from the writing table and placed it near the door. The maid lowered herself into it mechanically, still clutching at her throat. Her gaze remained fixed downward, but with the intensity of a person unwilling rather than unable to look up. Dr. Reeve bent over her. "Can you hear me?" She nodded. "You have had a fright, that is all. There is no need to speak immediately. Breathe slowly." He gave instructions to one of the footmen, who had by now been drawn to the threshold by the unusual silence in the house and the absence of the coffee tray. Lady Wynne, never losing command of herself, directed that no one was to leave the room until she had decided what must be done. That announcement, though spoken with outward calm, had an immediate effect. Faces altered. Vale lifted his brows with cool insolence. Adrian Lee's expression hardened. Colonel Ashby planted his feet more firmly apart. The words had transformed a scene of tragedy into one of confinement. Dr. Reeve straightened. "I must be plain," he said. "This appears to have been heart failure. The shock may have been sufficient. But in the circumstances—" "In the circumstances," interrupted Adrian Lee, "a doctor ought not to speculate aloud." Dr. Reeve gave him a level look. "Then I shall say only that the police must be informed." No one disputed that. The nearest village constable was sent for, and with him the Wynne motor was dispatched toward the station at Elmsford, where the local inspector might be reached more quickly by telephone. In the interval, there followed that strained and unnatural waiting which is perhaps more difficult to bear than any decisive event. The body remained in the library, covered now by a traveling rug. The open safe yawned darkly behind the displaced tapestry. Lamps burned steadily. Outside, the black windows reflected back the figures within like silent doubles. Lady Wynne requested, indeed, he required, that the guests remain downstairs. Some sat in the drawing-room, some in the morning-room adjoining, but no one withdrew to bed. The ordinary rhythms of the house had been arrested. One felt that if a clock had struck, the sound itself would have seemed an impropriety. The maid, Millie, had been taken to the housekeeper's room, where Dr. Reeve examined her more carefully. When he returned after 20 minutes, the others looked toward him at once. "Well?" asked Colonel Ashby. "She's not physically injured," said the doctor. "Her voice has failed temporarily from shock, or hysteria, if you prefer the crude term. She understands what is said to her, but is incapable of speaking." "Incapable," repeated Vale. "How convenient." Miss Trent turned upon him. "Really, Mr. Vale?" He shrugged. "I merely observe the elegance of the timing, as a witness who cannot witness." Eleanor, seated a little apart near the fire, said without raising her voice, "There are things more elegant than malice, Mr. Vale. Silence is not always chosen." He looked at her but did not answer. It was then, perhaps because tension seeks an outlet, that conversation began in fragments to gather around the absent painting. What precisely was the vermilion? How recently had Sir Alistair acquired it? Who among them had known it was in the safe? Had any servant knowledge of the combination? Each question seemed simple enough, yet every answer produced some slight disquieting extension. The painting, it emerged, was a small Dutch interior of the 17th century, attributed to Jan Vermeulen, a master so minor that his works were seldom seen and hotly contested when they were. And yet this particular example had, according to Cedric Vale, an importance beyond its size. It was not merely rare, he said, standing with one elbow on the mantel and turning a cigarette case in his fingers. It had a history, a disputed provenance, an unfortunate transfer during the occupation of Belgium. A widow in Bruges who maintained it had been forced to part with it for a sum that was not so much insulting as grotesque. Sir Alister's niece looked up. "Then what I said at dinner was true." Vale inclined his head. "Morally, probably. Legally, that depends on the skill of the solicitors concerned." Lady Wynne, who had heard this without any visible change of expression, said, "And yet my husband bought it openly." "Openly enough," said Vale, "but openness is often only the last coat of varnish." Adrian Lee, who had thus far been pacing the room in short, measured lines, stopped. "This is idle. The man is dead." "Quite," said Vale, "and the picture gone. One fact does not cancel the other." Colonel Ashby looked from one to another with growing irritation. "We are talking nonsense. If Alister died of a seizure, he died of a seizure. The theft is separate." "Is it?" asked Eleanor. Nobody answered her directly, but the possibility once introduced remained. At a little past midnight, the local constable arrived, breathless and overawed by the house, followed some 20 minutes later by Inspector March of the county police, a square, conscientious man with the complexion of one who spent more time in offices than fields, but whose eyes missed little. He approached the matter soberly and without theatricality, and which recommended him at once to Lady Wynne. The body was examined. Dr. Reeve repeated his first opinion with professional caution, that the cause of death appeared consistent with heart failure brought on by violent shock or agitation. Yet certain questions, he admitted, would remain until a fuller examination could be made. March accepted that with a grunt which might have meant anything. He then inspected the safe, the library windows, the doors, and the positions in which the guests stated they had been standing. His manner was plain, but not clumsy. "No signs of forcing," he said. "So either the painting was removed before tonight, or it was taken by someone who could open that safe." "It was there this afternoon," said Lady Wynne. "You saw it yourself, madam?" Her pause was the briefest imaginable. "No. My husband said it was there." March nodded as though storing away not the words, but the pause itself. He questioned the servants first. The butler had seen nothing unusual. The footman had moved between pantry and drawing-room. The housekeeper knew no more than that Milly had gone with the coffee tray to the library corridor and returned white as paper, incapable of speech. The girl herself, when brought in, proved indeed mute. March tried patience, firmness, and kindness in turn. He received only desperate eyes, a shaking head, and once a sudden clutching at the chair arm when he mentioned the library door. "She saw something," he said at last. Dr. Reeve answered, "Obviously. But until she regained speech—" "Or writes it," said Eleanor. All turned. Milly had been staring at the carpet. Now, at those words, she looked up swiftly. The March seized at once on the suggestion. Paper was brought. A fountain pen was placed in her hand. For an instant, hope quickened the room. The girl bent over the page. Her fingers trembled so violently that the nib scratched. She made one jagged downward line, then another. Suddenly, she dropped the pen as though it burned her and covered her face. The sheet lay on the table. Across it, in frantic, broken strokes, was something that might have been the beginning of a letter, or merely the record of terror. March exhaled through his nose. Not tonight. He next turned to the guests, and the atmosphere altered once more. Each person present was asked to account for his or her movements from the moment the party rose from dinner until Sir Alister opened the safe. The statements, taken separately, seemed harmless. As yet together they formed the first untidy map of contradiction. Miss Trent had been in the drawing-room nearly the whole time except for a brief absence to fetch a shawl from upstairs. Adrian Lee had gone to the smoking-room for matches he later discovered were in his pocket. Colonel Ashby had remained with Sir Alister after dinner longer than the others, discussing some old regimental matter before joining the company. Vale claimed to have wandered nowhere at all, but to have examined books in the library while waiting for the promised exhibition. Harmon had, as secretary, gone twice to Sir Alister's study on small business connected with the Morning Post. Eleanor admitted that she had gone out onto the terrace for air. "In this weather?" said March. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." His glance moved to Lady Wynne, who said coolly, "My niece is in the habit of preferring solitude to company." Eleanor did not look at her aunt. It was near 2 in the morning when March, having completed his first round of questions, asked one final practical matter. Was anyone expected at the house tonight who did not arrive? It was Harmon who answered. No one expected. But the butler, standing near the door, cleared his throat. "There was a gentleman's card left this afternoon, sir." March turned. "For Sir Alister?" "Yes, sir. He was out at the time. The visitor did not wait." "Name?" The butler hesitated, then produced from his pocketbook a small engraved card he had evidently retained from habit. March took it, glanced down, and his brows drew together. "Curious," he said. "What name?" asked Lady Wynne. The inspector looked around the room before replying. "Be Monsieur Hercule Poirot." For a moment, no one spoke. The name seemed to move through the room slowly, as though it required time to attach itself to memory. Several of the guests looked blank. Others reacted with a subtle quickening of attention. Inspector March turned the card between his fingers. "Hercule Poirot," he repeated. "Does the name mean anything to anyone here?" Miss Trent was the first to answer. "I have heard it," she said thoughtfully. "A detective, is he not? Belgian?" "A very celebrated one," said Cedric Vale with mild interest. "He has a reputation for solving those crimes that appear most elegantly insoluble." March looked toward Lady Wynne. Was Sir Alister expecting to see him? "Not to my knowledge," she said calmly. Her tone was so composed that it was almost impossible to imagine surprise disturbing it, yet there was the faintest tightening around her mouth. Colonel Ashby gave a puzzled grunt. "What would a detective want with Alister?" "That," said Vale softly, "is exactly the question." Inspector March slipped the card into his notebook. "And the visitor left no message?" "No, sir," said the butler. "He merely asked that the card be delivered." "And at what time did he call?" "A little after 4 in the afternoon." March nodded slowly. Sir Alister had been alive then, comfortably alive, secure in his house and his possessions. If the famous Belgian detective had sought him only hours before his death, it was not likely to have been a social courtesy. "Did Sir Alister see the card when he returned?" March asked. "Yes, sir. I placed it on the tray with the evening correspondence." "And did he remark upon it?" The butler hesitated again. "He appeared displeased, sir." "Displeased?" "Yes. He asked who had admitted the gentleman and whether he had left any explanation for calling. When I said no, Sir Alister placed the card in his pocket." March wrote that down. Across the room, Eleanor Wynne's gaze had sharpened. "Did he say nothing else?" "No, miss." The inspector looked around the assembled company once more. The air had subtly changed. What had earlier been a housebound mystery, the death of a man and the disappearance of a painting, had now acquired an external thread. Someone from outside had already been moving toward it. "Very well," March said at last. "That may or may not concern us, but I shall certainly inquire into it." Cedric Vale leaned back slightly against the mantelpiece. "Inspector, if the gentleman in question is indeed the Hercule Poirot, you may find he inquires into you as well." March gave him a steady glance. "That remains to be seen." The inspector then returned to practical matters. The body must be removed, arrangements made for a formal examination, and until further notice, no one present was to leave Blackthorn House without informing the police. No one protested openly, though Adrian Lee's lips compressed with irritation. "This will cause some inconvenience," he said. "I imagine so." said March. But murder, if murder it proves to be, is seldom considerate. Surely we are not speaking of murder, said Colonel Ashby bluntly. That, replied March, is exactly what we are not yet certain of. The statement hung in the room with a chill clarity. Sir Alistair Wynne had collapsed the instant he discovered the missing painting. Shock alone might account for it. But if the theft and the death were linked, if the painting had been removed deliberately to provoke that moment, then the matter altered profoundly. Someone in the house might have known exactly how Sir Alistair would react. The inspector closed his notebook. For tonight, I shall ask only one more question. Who among you knew the combination to the safe? No one answered immediately. Lady Wynne said quietly, "My husband alone." Inspector March regarded her for a moment. "Are you certain of that?" "Yes." Colonel Ashby nodded. Alistair was particular about such things. Vale gave a faint shrug. Collectors are often possessive. March's eyes moved to Harmon. "And you, Mr. Harmon? As secretary, did you ever open the safe for Sir Alistair?" Harmon adjusted his spectacles. "Only when he was present, Inspector. Never alone." "Did you know the combination?" "No." March made another note. The questioning continued for some time, but yielded little beyond what had already been established. No one admitted to approaching the safe before Sir Alistair opened it. No one had seen another guest do so. The servants, moving in their ordinary duties, had observed nothing unusual until Millie's strange silence. At last, March closed the matter for the night. "You have all been cooperative," he said. "Tomorrow morning I shall require further statements, but for the moment you may retire." The guests dispersed slowly, but each carrying away the same unspoken awareness. The house itself had become a kind of trap. Eleanor Wynne was among the last to leave the drawing-room. As she stepped into the corridor, she saw Millie again. The maid stood near the staircase, the housekeeper beside her like a stern guardian. Millie's eyes met Eleanor's. There was something in that look, something desperate and urgent, that made Eleanor pause. The girl lifted one hand slightly, almost imperceptibly. Then she looked quickly over her shoulder, toward the library door. Eleanor followed the glance. The door was closed now. Behind it lay the place where Sir Alistair had died, and where the safe had stood open and empty. Millie's hand trembled. She touched her throat again. Then she made a small motion with her fingers, 3 quick taps against the banister rail. Tap, 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 and Eleanor frowned faintly. It did not resemble a signal so much as a memory. Before she could question it further, the housekeeper guided the girl away toward the servants' quarters. Eleanor stood a moment longer in the corridor, thinking. From somewhere deeper in the house came the distant murmur of Inspector March speaking to the butler. The great clock in the hall struck 3, each chime echoing heavily in the silence. Blackthorn House had settled into uneasy darkness. Yet one thought would not leave Eleanor's mind. If the Belgian detective had come to see Sir Alistair that afternoon, he must have had a reason, and if he had not yet spoken with him, then perhaps the truth about the Vermeulen painting, and about the man who had died because of it, had already begun its journey toward Blackthorn House, was she without anyone in the house yet realizing it. And somewhere upstairs, in the narrow servants' room where the frightened maid now sat awake, the only witness to what had truly happened, still struggled with the terrible fact that she had seen the crime, and could not speak a single word of it. Morning came reluctantly to Blackthorn House. The pale light of a grey autumn sky spread slowly across the lawns and terraces, revealing a world that appeared outwardly unchanged. The gravel drive was neat, the hedges trimmed, and the long windows of the house reflected the thin daylight as calmly as they had the evening before. Yet inside, every person in the house carried the same awareness. Sir Alistair Wynne had died in the night, and the quiet rooms were now the scene of something darker than tragedy. Eleanor Wynne had slept little. and she had remained awake long after the others retired, sitting near the window of her room and replaying the strange events of the evening with relentless clarity. Again and again, her thoughts returned to the same image. Millie standing in the doorway, pale and terrified, staring towards someone in the room. Not toward the body, towards someone. That detail disturbed her more than anything else. At a little after 8, she went downstairs. The house felt unnaturally still. Even the servants moved with a hushed restraint, as though any ordinary sound might break some fragile balance. Inspector March had already returned. Eleanor saw him in the morning room speaking with the butler over a notebook. His manner remained steady and practical, but the lines around his mouth had deepened. He looked up as she entered. "Good morning. Miss Wynne." "Good morning, Inspector. I hope you managed to rest." "Not particularly." "That is understandable." He closed the notebook. "I should like to ask you a few additional questions this morning, if you don't mind." "Of course." He gestured toward a chair by the window. "Last night you mentioned going onto the terrace after dinner." "Yes." "For how long?" 10 minutes, perhaps." "And your purpose?" "Air." March studied her expression carefully. "You appeared troubled earlier in the evening. At dinner." "That is not a question, Inspector." "No," he said quietly. "But it may become one." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "My uncle and I disagreed." "About the painting?" "Yes. You believed it had been obtained dishonestly. I believed it had been taken from someone who had no power to refuse." March nodded slowly. "Did Sir Alistair know the person from whom the painting came?" "Yes." "Was that person likely to seek its return?" "I imagine so." The inspector made another note. "Did you discuss this matter with anyone else present last night?" "No." March leaned back slightly. "One more thing. While you were on the terrace, did you see anyone enter or leave the house?" Eleanor hesitated. "No." The inspector noticed the hesitation immediately. "But I heard something." "What?" "A door closing somewhere inside the house." March's pencil paused. "Which door?" "I cannot say. It sounded distant." "Was it before or after you returned inside?" "Before." He nodded again. "That may be useful." Their conversation ended there for the moment, but Eleanor had the distinct impression that the inspector was already forming quiet conclusions of his own. Meanwhile, the other guests appeared one by one at breakfast, though the meal itself had none of the ease such gatherings usually possess. Colonel Ashby arrived first, looking as though he had slept badly but determined to conceal it with soldierly stiffness. Adrian Lee followed, impeccably dressed despite the circumstances, though his impatience was evident in every clipped movement. Miss Trent came later, calm and observant, her dark eyes taking in the altered mood of the house. Cedric Vale entered last. He glanced around the room with mild curiosity. "Well," he said lightly, "we have survived the night." Colonel Ashby frowned. "Confounded thing to say." "Why?" "Statistically, it is quite remarkable." Miss Trent gave him a cool look. "You appear to find the situation entertaining." "Not entertaining," Vale replied smoothly. "Thus interesting." Inspector March soon joined them. "I shall require a few more statements this morning," he announced. "After that, you may be free to leave, depending on developments." "Developments?" said Lee sharply. March ignored the tone. "First, however, I should like to examine the library again." They returned there together. The room looked much as it had the night before, though the body had been removed and the rug folded away. The safe still stood open behind the displaced tapestry. March inspected it again with patient care. "No damage," he said. "No marks on the lock." "So whoever took the painting knew the combination," said Lee, "or opened it while Sir Alistair himself was present." "Impossible," Colonel Ashby muttered. March did not reply. Instead, he examined the surrounding furniture and the carpet carefully. And a few moments later he crouched slightly and touched something near the edge of the desk. "A small mark," he said. Vale leaned forward. "Dust disturbed?" "Perhaps." March straightened. "We shall see." At that moment a quiet knock sounded at the door. The butler entered. "Inspector, there is a gentleman here asking to see you." "His name?" "Hercule Poirot, sir." Every person in the room turned at once. March raised his eyebrows slightly. "Well," he said calmly, "that saves me the trouble of finding him." A moment later, the Belgian detective entered the library. He was smaller than some expected, yet there was something remarkably composed about him. His clothes were immaculate, his mustaches perfectly arranged, and his eyes, bright, alert, and quietly amused, moved across the room with delicate precision. He removed his hat politely. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "I regret that my visit to Blackthorn House is accompanied by such unfortunate circumstances." Inspector March stepped forward. "Monsieur Poirot?" "At your service." "I am Inspector March." "Enchanté." March gestured toward the room. "You are aware of what has happened?" "Yes." "May I ask how?" Poirot folded his gloves carefully. "This morning I received a telephone call from the police station at Elmsford. They informed me that Sir Alistair Wynne had died suddenly and that a painting had disappeared from his safe." "And your interest in the matter?" Poirot's eyes flickered briefly toward the safe. "Yesterday afternoon I came here hoping to speak with Sir Alistair about that same painting." Vale smiled faintly. "The Vermeulen." "Precisely." Poirot turned slowly, studying each face in the room with calm attention. "I wish to ask Sir Alistair," he continued softly, "why a painting believed stolen during the war had recently appeared in his private collection." Silence filled the library. Then Poirot added gently, "Unfortunately, I arrived too late." His gaze moved to the open safe. "But perhaps," he said, "not too late to discover the truth." Inspector March studied the small Belgian for a moment, measuring him in silence. Poirot returned the look with mild interest, his head slightly inclined, as though the inspector himself were a specimen worthy of quiet examination. "Well," said March at last, "it appears you have arrived at an appropriate moment, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot spread his hands gently. "Crime, my friend, rarely concerns itself with appropriate moments. It merely occurs, and then it is for us to arrange the disorder it leaves behind." His eyes moved again to the open safe. "So, the Vermeulen is gone?" "Yes," said March, "and Sir Alistair Wynne collapsed immediately after discovering that fact." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "A dramatic sequence of events." "Possibly connected," March said. "Possibly," Poirot agreed. The detective walked slowly across the room toward the tapestry and the steel door behind it. His movements were deliberate and unhurried. One had the impression that nothing in the room escaped him, not the position of the chairs, the dust along the skirting boards, nor the subtle tension in the air among the gathered guests. He leaned slightly toward the safe, but did not touch it. "May I?" he asked. March gestured. "Of course." Poirot bent forward, peering inside with bright curiosity, and then he straightened and turned back toward the room. "The safe shows no signs of force." "No," said March. "Which means," Poirot continued gently, "that whoever removed the painting opened it quite comfortably. That is the working assumption." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "Tell me, Inspector, how many people knew the combination?" "According to Lady Wynne, only Sir Alistair." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, according to Lady Wynne." There was no accusation in his tone, yet the remark carried weight. He turned toward the group. "If you will forgive me, mesdames et messieurs, I must ask a few questions. They will seem simple, perhaps even foolish, but the foolish questions are sometimes the most illuminating." Cedric Vale gave a faint smile. "How refreshing." Poirot acknowledged him with a courteous nod. First, he said, I should like to know the exact moment when Sir Alistair discovered the painting was gone. Colonel Ashby answered. When he opened the safe last night, just before he collapsed. And why did he open it? To show us the picture, said Miss Trent. Ah, yes. An exhibition. Poirot nodded slowly. So the safe was opened publicly. Exactly, said Vale. Everyone present saw that the painting was missing. Yes. Poirot turned to Inspector March. And before that moment, had anyone else examined the safe yesterday evening? No. Very good. Poirot walked toward the writing desk near the center of the room. He ran one finger lightly along its polished surface, then glanced at the faint disturbance March had noticed earlier. Inspector, he said quietly, you have already seen this. March nodded. Yes. A small movement here. A chair, perhaps, or a person leaning. Possibly. Poirot straightened. But we must not hurry. Order, always order. His gaze moved thoughtfully around the room until it settled on Eleanor Wynne. Miss Wynne, he said politely, may I ask you something? Of course. I understand you disagreed with your uncle at dinner about the painting. Yes. You believed it belonged to someone else. Yes. Poirot regarded her kindly. You wished it returned. I wished the truth acknowledged. Poirot nodded with approval. Très bien. Then he asked quietly, and did your uncle intend to sell the painting? No. Then why keep it? Eleanor hesitated. Because possessing it proved something to him. Ah. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes. There are many men who collect not objects, but victories. Colonel Ashby shifted impatiently. So surely we are drifting from the point. Poirot turned toward him. On the contrary, Colonel, we are approaching it. He continued pacing slowly, speaking almost to himself. A painting stolen long ago. A man determined to keep it. Guests invited to admire it. And a detective arriving unexpectedly the same afternoon to question its ownership. His eyes lifted again. Such a coincidence rarely remains a coincidence. Adrian Lee folded his arms. Are you suggesting someone stole the painting to prevent your questions? Poirot considered this. It is one possibility. Vale spoke lightly. Or someone took it simply because it was valuable. Also possible. But if that were the case, Vale added, why leave the safe untouched until Sir Alistair opened it himself? Poirot's eyes gleamed. An excellent question. Monsieur Vale. He turned again toward Inspector March. Tell me about the servant girl, the one who saw something. Millie, said March. She delivered coffee to the corridor outside the library shortly before the safe was opened. When she returned, she was unable to speak. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Unable or unwilling? The doctor believes shock. Perhaps. Poirot walked slowly toward the window. And where is she now? In the servants' quarters. May I see her? March hesitated only a moment. Yes. They left the library together. As they walked along the corridor, Poirot spoke quietly. Inspector, may I ask, when Sir Alistair collapsed, where was each person standing? March described the positions as he remembered them. Poirot listened attentively, occasionally nodding. When the inspector finished, Ma Poirot said softly, and the maid, where was she? In the doorway. Looking into the room? Yes. Looking at the body? March shook his head. No. Poirot stopped walking. Then at whom? March frowned. Miss Wynne mentioned something similar. Indeed. Poirot's eyes sparkled faintly. Then the little witness saw not only a dead man, but the living person responsible. They resumed walking. Moments later, they reached the small sitting room where Millie had been resting under the supervision of the housekeeper. The girl sat near the window, pale and exhausted. When Poirot entered, she looked up nervously. He approached her gently, removing his hat. Bonjour, mademoiselle. She stared at him uncertainly. Poirot's voice softened. You cannot speak. That is unfortunate. But it does not matter. He tapped his temple lightly. Because you still remember. Millie's hands tightened in her lap. Poirot crouched slightly so that his eyes were level with hers. Last night, he said quietly, you stood in the doorway of the library. You saw something that frightened you very much. The girl's breathing quickened. You saw someone near the safe. Her eyes widened. Poirot continued calmly. Yes, I think you did. Millie's lips trembled. Poirot did not press her further. Instead, he took a small sheet of paper from his pocket and placed it gently on the table beside her. Do not try to write the whole story, he said kindly. Only one thing. He drew a simple shape on the paper, a small circle. Tell me this, he said softly. Did you see the person who took the painting? Millie stared at the paper. Her hand moved slowly toward the pen, and everyone in the room held their breath. The girl hesitated for a long moment. Then, with trembling fingers, she began to write a single name. The pen trembled so violently in Millie's hand that for a moment it seemed impossible she would manage even a single letter. Poirot did not hurry her. He remained crouched beside the table, watching with the quiet patience of a man who understood that pressure often destroys the very truth one hopes to obtain. Inspector March stood behind him, arms folded, his eyes fixed on the page. The housekeeper hovered anxiously near the door. Slowly, painfully, the girl pressed the nib against the paper. A crooked line appeared, then another. She stopped abruptly. Her eyes lifted from the paper and fixed on something behind Poirot's shoulder. The terror returned instantly, raw, uncontrollable. Her hand jerked backward. The pen fell, clattering against the table. Poirot turned at once. In the doorway stood Mr. Felix Harmon. The secretary looked faintly surprised to find himself the center of such attention. I beg your pardon, he said calmly. I did not mean to interrupt. Millie shrank back in her chair as though she had seen something dangerous. Poirot rose slowly. Ah, Monsieur Harmon, he said gently. You come at an interesting moment. Harmon glanced briefly at the paper. Indeed. Inspector March stepped forward and lifted the sheet. 2 shaky letters had been written before the girl stopped, a crooked H, and what might have been the beginning of an A. March looked up sharply. Harmon noticed the movement but did not ask what had been written. I merely came to inform you, Inspector, he said evenly, that the motor car you requested has arrived. March folded the paper quietly and placed it in his notebook. Thank you. Harmon nodded and withdrew without another word. Only when he had gone did Millie begin to breathe again. Poirot watched her thoughtfully. Interesting, he murmured. Inspector March frowned. You think she was writing his name? Poirot shook his head slightly. No, that would be too easy. Then what frightened her? Poirot turned the folded paper gently between his fingers. The fact that she had begun. March studied him. You believe she recognized him? Perhaps. Poirot glanced toward the corridor where Harmon had disappeared. But recognition is not the same as guilt. He looked again at the letters. March frowned. Harmon begins with H. Yes. And the A? Poirot smiled faintly. So the alphabet is full of possibilities, my friend. They left the girl to rest and returned toward the library. As they walked, Inspector March spoke in a low voice. You noticed how she reacted when he entered? Certainly. That was fear. Yes. Which suggests he may be the one she saw. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Or someone she believes dangerous. That sounds like the same thing. Poirot gave a small shrug. Sometimes, but not always. They reached the library again. Inside, the other guests had resumed their uneasy waiting. Conversation ceased the moment Poirot and March entered. Cedric Vale broke the silence first. "Well, has the little witness recovered her voice?" "No," said March. Vale sighed theatrically. What a disappointment. Poirot walked slowly toward the fireplace. Not entirely a disappointment," he said quietly. Vale raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" The young lady attempted to write something. Every eye in the room sharpened instantly. "What did she write?" asked Colonel Ashby. March replied carefully. "Only the beginning of a name." Adrian Lee's expression hardened. "Whose name?" "We are not yet certain." Vale gave a faint smile. How tantalizing. Poirot looked around the room thoughtfully. "Permit me a small question," he said. "Yesterday afternoon between 4 and 6 o'clock, did any of you visit the library?" Colonel Ashby shook his head. "No." Miss Trent said calmly, "I did not." Lee shrugged. "I had no reason to." Vale smiled. "I admire books, but not enough to inspect locked safes." Poirot turned to Hamon. "And you, monsieur?" Hamon adjusted his spectacles. "I came here briefly last evening while waiting for the others. The safe was still closed." "Ah." Poirot nodded slowly. "And did you see Sir Alistair open it at any time before dinner?" "No." Poirot's eyes flickered briefly to Eleanor Wynne. "And you, mademoiselle?" "No," she said quietly. Poirot nodded again. "Very good." He began pacing slowly across the room. "There is something curious about this affair." "Only one thing?" Vale murmured. Poirot ignored the remark. "A painting disappears from a locked safe, yet the thief does not attempt to escape with it immediately. Instead, the safe remains closed until the owner himself opens it before witnesses." Colonel Ashby frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "That the thief wished the disappearance to be discovered in precisely that moment." Lee crossed his arms. "So to shock Sir Alistair." "Exactly." Inspector March spoke thoughtfully. "And the shock killed him." "Possibly." Vale watched Poirot with growing interest. "You are proposing a rather elaborate plan." Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps." "But why go to such trouble?" Ashby demanded. "Why not simply steal the painting and be done with it?" Poirot stopped walking. "Because the painting may not have been the true objective." Silence filled the room. Miss Trent spoke softly. "You mean Sir Alistair himself was the target?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps." March frowned. "If that is the case, then whoever planned this knew two things: that the painting was valuable enough to create shock, and that Sir Alistair would open the safe in front of witnesses." "Precisely." Vale tapped ash from his cigarette. "So that narrows the field considerably." Poirot smiled. "Yes, only someone familiar with Sir Alistair's habits would predict such behavior." Eleanor spoke quietly. "Someone who knew his pride." Poirot inclined his head. "Très juste." March looked around the room. "So we have a thief who knew the safe, knew Sir Alistair, and wanted the painting's disappearance revealed publicly." Colonel Ashby's patience finally snapped. "Then say it plainly. One of us did it." Poirot raised a finger gently. "Perhaps." Ashby stared. "Perhaps." "Yes." Poirot turned toward the safe once more. "There is still one difficulty." "What difficulty?" March asked. Poirot gestured toward the steel door. "If the thief opened the safe before last night, he must have known the combination." March nodded, "which only Sir Alistair possessed." Poirot smiled faintly. But did he?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Inspector March's eyes narrowed. "You think someone else learned it?" Poirot said quietly, "I think someone watched him open the safe before." Vale murmured with interest, "And the maid saw that person last night." Poirot looked toward the doorway thoughtfully. "Yes," he paused, "which is why she is so afraid." Eleanor frowned. "Afraid of the thief?" Poirot shook his head gently. "No. His voice softened. She is afraid of the truth. The phrase seemed to perplex them more than any direct accusation could have done. Inspector March, who had thus far followed Poirot's reasoning with a practical if guarded attention, gave the Belgian a keen look. "The truth?" he repeated. "In what sense?" Poirot did not answer immediately, till he moved to the mantel and stood with one hand lightly resting upon it, his reflection wavering in the dark glass above. When he spoke, it was with that curious mildness which in him often preceded a sharper point. "A servant girl such as Milly does not, I think, traffic naturally in grand moral ideas. She is frightened, not because she grasps the elegant structure of the crime, but because what she saw does not fit with what she believes she ought to say. There is a difference." Cedric Vale tilted his head. "You imply conflict between what she witnessed and what she wishes to protect." "Exactly," Colonel Ashby grunted. "Protect whom?" Poirot turned his palms upward. "That is what we must discover." Inspector March said, "The letters she wrote, H and perhaps A, suggest at least a direction." Poirot made a small movement of assent. "A direction, yes. But if one walks too quickly in the first direction that presents itself, one very often arrives at the wrong destination." His gaze moved to Harmon, who had resumed his place near the bookcase. The secretary stood composed, though the stillness of his posture now seemed less like discretion than effort. "Monsieur Harmon," said Poirot pleasantly, "you were long in Sir Alistair's service." 7 years. A most intimate position. "I handled business correspondence and appointments, nothing more." Poirot smiled. "You make it sound so modest, yet the secretary to a man like Sir Alistair knows which letters disturb him, which names he receives gladly, and which he puts in his pocket." Harmon did not at once reply. "You refer to your card yesterday afternoon." "Among other things." "I did not know who you were." "Ce monsieur." "That is unfortunate." Sir Alistair did. A faint flush rose above the secretary's collar, then subsided. Inspector March took over. "Mr. Harmon, did Sir Alistair discuss Monsieur Poirot's visit with you?" "No." "Did he discuss the Vermeulen painting?" "Only in practical terms. Insurance, cataloguing, security." "And its ownership?" Harmon's face remained neutral. "No." Poirot intervened softly. "Insurance, yes. Security, yes. A man does not insure what he thinks of as morally doubtful unless he is prepared to defend the doubt." Vale gave a soft laugh. An admirably modern philosophy. Lady Wynne, who had been silent through much of this, now spoke with quiet firmness. "Monsieur Poirot, are you here to recover a painting or to insult the dead?" Poirot turned to her at once and bowed slightly. "Madame, sir, when a man dies in the midst of concealment, the truth is never flattering. But I do not insult him. I merely observe that he was a man of appetites, one appetite in particular being possession." Lady Wynne held his gaze, then looked away first. "It was Eleanor who broke the tension. You think my uncle's death was arranged by someone who knew his vanity?" "I think," said Poirot, "that pride is often the handle by which one moves another human being." Inspector March took a step toward the desk. "There is one immediate question. If someone learned the combination by watching Sir Alistair, when could that have happened, and who would have had the opportunity?" "Excellent," said Poirot. "Now we begin to be useful." He looked around the room. "I should like to know Sir Alistair's habits with this safe. Did he open it privately, on or with display?" Colonel Ashby said, "Both. He was cautious, but he liked an audience when it suited him." Vale nodded. "Particularly when the audience contained people whose admiration he had not yet exhausted." Miss Trent said coolly, "That describes half the men who collect art, and all those who lend to theatres." For the first time Poirot permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "Then our field broadens. If Sir Alistair liked to exhibit his treasures, someone may indeed have observed the combination without his suspecting it, or while pretending not to observe. March said, "We need particulars." "Just so." The inspector began again, more narrowly this time, asking each person whether he or she had ever seen Sir Alister open the safe before the previous evening. The answers came with varying degrees of certainty and honesty. Colonel Ashby admitted that he had seen the safe opened once, perhaps twice, though he insisted he had paid no attention to the combination. Miss Trent said she had been present in the room on one occasion, but had been examining a miniature on the far wall. Vale said blandly that he had enough interest in art to notice everything and enough manners not to admit it. Adrian Lee denied ever having been near the safe when it was opened, but said the very denial seemed to offend him. Lady Wynne replied that she had naturally seen her husband use it many times, though never with deliberate attention. Eleanor said she had seen it open as a child, and once again recently. Harmon, after the smallest pause, said that Sir Alister had occasionally opened it while dictating letters or checking inventories, and that one cannot work beside a man for 7 years without learning his habits. Poirot's eyes sharpened at that. "One cannot indeed," March said, "so a number of you had opportunity." "Opportunity to observe," said Poirot, "but not necessarily motive to act." At that word, the room seemed to recoil inward. Motive had been present from the beginning, like a guest everyone pretended not to recognize. Now it stood among them plainly. "Let us not be childish," said Vale. "Nearly everyone in this house had a motive for something. Money, resentment, fear, loyalty, scandal. It is an unusually well-stocked weekend." Adrian Lee turned on him. "You speak as though you know the contents of everyone's conscience." "No," said Vale, "only that Sir Alister inspired very little disinterested affection." Colonel Ashby said harshly, "Sir, he inspired loyalty in some of us." "Did he?" Vale's tone remained light. "Or merely indebtedness?" "Enough," snapped Lady Wynne. Poirot raised one hand. "Monsieur Vale enjoys the dangerous luxury of saying aloud what others prefer to leave upholstered. But let us be exact. Motive is not the same as guilt. It is merely the soil in which guilt may grow." He turned suddenly to Miss Trent. "Mademoiselle, you are connected with a theatrical enterprise in which Sir Alister had invested." She inclined her head. "Yes." "And was the arrangement harmonious?" "Financial arrangements rarely are." "Did you owe him money?" "No." "Did he owe you freedom?" A faint color rose in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "If you mean did he attempt to direct what he had paid for, the answer is yes." "Ah." Poirot nodded. "Possession again." He shifted his attention to Adrian Lee. "And you, monsieur, were indebted politically?" Lee's mouth hardened. "Sir Alister contributed to a committee." "Only one?" A brief silence followed. "He expected influence in return," said Lee. "Of course." Poirot looked to Colonel Ashby. "Old friendship." "Yes. Old friendship can hide new dependence." Ashby stared at him. "I will not answer impertinence." "Then your silence must answer for you." The colonel reddened darkly. Eleanor said suddenly, "You need not ask me. I quarrelled with my uncle openly. Everyone knows why." Poirot turned to her with unexpected gentleness. "And because you quarrelled openly, mademoiselle, I am less interested in your anger than in the anger that remained polite." That touched more than one person in the room. Inspector March, who had been making notes, now looked up. "There is also the question of timing. If the painting was removed before dinner, why did no one leave the house with it? We have found nothing in bedrooms or luggage yet, but the search is incomplete." Poirot said, "Exactly. The object has vanished, yet it has not truly departed. That tells us something." Vale folded his arms. "That the thief is patient?" "Or interrupted," said Poirot. He crossed to the safe again and looked not within it, but at the paneling around it. Then he stepped back and glanced toward the library door, then to the writing desk, then to the window. The order of these observations seemed trivial, but March watched him closely. "What is it?" the inspector asked. Poirot answered absently. "I'm arranging the scene, and there is always the temptation to think of a crime as a single act. In truth, it is usually a conversation. One person acts, another observes, a third misunderstands, and a fourth arrives just too late." His gaze settled on the door. Millie brought the coffee tray to the corridor outside. She saw something, but perhaps not what we first supposed. March frowned. "You think she did not actually see the theft?" "I think she may have seen the aftermath, or the concealment, or the face of someone discovering something they ought not to have discovered." Lady Wynne said quietly, "You are multiplying possibilities." Poirot bowed, "Until one possibility begins to reduce the others." At that moment, the butler appeared. "Inspector, Monsieur Poirot, there is a telephone call from London. For Monsieur Poirot, sir." Poirot looked mildly surprised. "For me?" "Yes, sir. The gentleman says the matter is urgent." Poirot excused himself and left the room. In his absence, the strain among the others seemed at once freer and more dangerous, as though the schoolmaster had stepped out and the children were uncertain whether to whisper or fight. It was Harmon who spoke first, and surprisingly to Eleanor. "Miss Wynne, I hope you do not think the inspector's inquiries imply suspicion of everyone equally." She looked at him. "That is exactly what they imply." "I only mean, I know what you mean, Mr. Harmon." He stopped. Vale watched the exchange with detached interest. Our industrious secretary does not care to be classed with the rest of us. Harmon said coldly, "I care to be classed accurately." "And how would you define your class in this house?" Vale asked. "Trusted, useful, or invisible?" A flash, very slight but unmistakable, passed through Harmon's eyes. "Better invisible," he said, "than ornamental." Miss Trent, who had until then remained by the window, gave a short laugh. "Touché." Vale smiled faintly but said nothing more. When Poirot returned, there was a visible change in him. He was still perfectly composed, but something in his expression had narrowed and brightened, like a lens brought suddenly into focus. Inspector March noticed it instantly. "News?" "A little." "Relevant?" "Very." Poirot addressed the room. "I have just spoken with a lady in Brussels, the niece of the late Madame Vermeulen, from whom the painting was taken during the occupation. She confirms two facts. First, that Sir Alister was recently warned, through an intermediary, that the family intended to make a formal claim. Second," he paused. Everyone was listening now. "Second, that a copy of the original ownership papers was sent to England 3 days ago to support that claim." "Sent to whom?" March asked. Poirot turned his head slowly and looked at Felix Harmon. "To Sir Alister's secretary." For the first time since Poirot's arrival, Felix Harmon lost command of his face. It was not a dramatic change. Nothing so crude as a start or an exclamation escaped him, but the blood withdrew from his cheeks, and the smooth neutrality on which he had relied all morning seemed to crack for a single instant, revealing strain beneath it. Inspector March saw it. "So," he said quietly, "you received those papers." Harmon recovered himself with visible effort. "I receive a great many papers, Inspector. That is not an answer." "No," said Harmon. It is a fact." Poirot stood with his fingertips lightly together, watching him. "And facts, mon ami, are always welcome. Let us have a few more. Did you receive the Vermeulen claim papers 3 days ago?" Harmon hesitated. The pause was brief, but fatal. "Yes." "Did you show them to Sir Alister?" "Yes." "At once?" Another pause. "No." Inspector March's voice sharpened. "Why not?" Harmon removed his spectacles, polished them with care, and replaced them. It was a small act, but in that moment it had the air of a man fortifying himself. "Because," he said, "Sir Alister was not a man who liked to receive unpleasant information without tactical preparation. Vale murmured. How delicately put. Harmon ignored him. I intended to present the matter after reviewing the legal position. Instead, said Poirot softly, as you kept the papers, for one day only. Where are they now? In Sir Alistair's study. March turned at once. You did not mention this last night. No one asked me about correspondence from Brussels. No, said March, only about matters connected to a missing painting and a dead man. Lady Wynne's eyes had narrowed. You concealed this from us? Harmon looked at her steadily. I concealed it from Sir Alistair for less than 24 hours. That is not the same thing. It may be worse, said Eleanor quietly. Poirot inclined his head slightly toward her, as though marking the remark. March moved to the door and called for a constable, instructing him to secure the study and bring any recent foreign correspondence at once. Then he returned his attention to Harmon. You are handling the claim to the painting. You knew Poirot called yesterday afternoon. You were seen by the witness and may have been the name she attempted to write, and you waited until now to mention the ownership papers. You're not making your position stronger. Harmon's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. I'm aware of that. Poirot spoke with sudden gentleness. Monsieur Harmon, when a man begins by being discreet, he often ends by appearing deceitful. The distinction matters less and less as events proceed. You would be wise now to be exact. Harmon met his gaze. Very well. Yes, I received the documents. Yes, I understood their significance. Yes, I knew that Monsieur Poirot's visit must be related. And yes, Sir Alistair was angry when I finally showed him the papers yesterday evening, shortly before dinner. That produced an immediate stir. You showed him before dinner, March said. Yes. Where? In his study. What happened? Harmon answered after a moment. He read them. He became furious. Not frightened. Furious. He said the claim was blackmail disguised as sentiment. He asked how long I had held the documents. I told him. He accused me of disloyalty. I reminded him that legal caution was not treachery. He dismissed me. Colonel Ashby let out a breath through his nose. That sounds like Alistair. But not, said Poirot. The whole of it. Harmon looked at him. No. No. Because if that were all, you would have told it sooner. The secretary's hands, clasped behind his back, tightened. There was more, he said at last. He told me the painting would never leave the house except on his own terms. He said that if any claim were made publicly, so he would destroy the papers, deny the provenance, and challenge the family to ruin themselves in court. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Poirot said, and did he also say what he intended to do with the painting? Harmon hesitated. Yes. What? He intended to move it. Where? To a bank in London, quietly, within a day or two. That changed the shape of things at once. Vale spoke first. Ah, then the theft acquires urgency. Yes, said Poirot. Very much urgency. March nodded slowly. If someone wanted the painting recovered, or hidden, or used against him, they had very little time. And so, said Poirot, the arrangement had to be made at once. Lady Wynne's voice came cool and even. Arrangement. You persist in speaking as though this were a theatrical performance. Poirot turned to her. Madame, the most domestic crimes are theatrical performances. The great difference is that the audience does not know it is attending one. The butler reappeared then with a leather folder and several envelopes recovered from Sir Alistair's study. March examined them quickly, then handed one to Poirot. It contained copies of old purchase records, wartime affidavits, and a covering letter in French from the Vermeulen family's solicitor. The dates corresponded precisely with what Poirot had been told. More interesting, however, was a second paper clipped behind them, a brief typed memorandum in Harmon's neat hand. March read it aloud. If matter presses, alternative may be to remove picture from house before formal claim is lodged. Safer if done through private intermediary. Discuss after dinner. Silence fell. Harmon said at once, "That note was not a plan. It was a memorandum of possibilities." "For whom?" March asked. "For Sir Alistair?" "Did you discuss it with him?" "No, he interrupted me before I could." Poirot reached for the paper and studied it. "Private intermediary," he murmured. "Interesting. Such phrases are little masks. They conceal so much while saying almost enough." He looked up. "To whom had you intended to entrust this private removal?" Harmon's expression altered by the smallest degree. "To no one in particular." "Again, almost enough," said Poirot. March stepped in. "Names?" There were no names. Vale gave a soft, amused breath. "Our secretary is devoted to vagueness. It must have been very useful to Sir Alistair." Harmon turned sharply on him. "At least I worked for my place in this house." "And what a place it was," said Vale. "Near enough to power to smell it, not near enough to touch it." "Stop it," said Miss Trent suddenly. Her voice was low, but the force in it stilled them both. Poirot's eyes moved to her swiftly. "Ah," he said softly. "Mademoiselle is fatigued by the quarrels of men." "By bad ones," she said. Poirot regarded her for a moment, then asked, "You knew of Sir Alistair's intention to move the painting?" "No." "You are certain?" "Yes." "But you knew there was trouble over it?" She paused. "I knew there had been letters. I did not know the details." "How?" "Harmon mentioned that Sir Alistair was in one of his imperial moods. There was just enough bitterness in the phrasing to suggest old irritation." Poirot nodded. "So, the existence of pressure concerning the painting was not a complete secret?" "No," said Eleanor quietly. Only the shape of the pressure." Inspector March folded the papers. "This still leaves the central problem. If Harmon wanted the painting removed privately, he had motive and perhaps opportunity. But that does not prove he took it, nor that Sir Alistair's death was intended." Poirot smiled faintly. "Quite so. In fact, I think Monsieur Harmon's error is different." Harmon looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Poirot turned the memorandum between his fingers. "I think you considered a discreet removal. I think you concealed documents. I think you feared scandal and perhaps hoped to manage events, but I do not think you are the person Millie saw committing the act." March frowned. Then why did she react to him? "Because she knows he knows something," said Poirot, "and because he belongs to the machinery of the house, and servants fear machinery more than they fear villains." Harmon said with controlled anger, "This is absurd." "No," said Poirot. "It is human." He crossed suddenly to the window and looked out over the terrace. The lawns were grey-green in the weak light. Beyond them the beeches stirred under a low wind. "When Miss Wynne stood outside last night," he said half to himself, "she heard a door close." "Which door?" "Not this one, perhaps. Not the library. Another room opening off the corridor. A study. A morning room. A cabinet. Someone moved quickly after an encounter." He turned back. "Tell me, between dinner and the gathering in the drawing room, was Sir Alistair alone at any point?" The answers came uncertainly. "Perhaps for several minutes, in moving from dining room to study and then to the ladies, in fetching cigars, in sending a note. The ordinary blurring of a house party began again to obscure the edges of exact sequence." Poirot nodded as though this confirmed something. "Yes, that is the difficulty with crowded houses. They create privacy by abundance." He then did an unexpected thing. He asked for the coffee tray Millie had carried the previous night. The butler, startled, fetched it from the pantry. It was a silver tray with cups, a coffee pot, cream jug, sugar basin, and 2 liqueur glasses which had not been used. Poirot examined it with extraordinary attention, not for fingerprints or stains, but for arrangement. "These cups," he said, "were they placed so?" The butler blinked. "I believe so, sir." "And Millie carried this alone?" "Yes, sir." Poirot lifted the tray, balanced it, then set it down again. Inspector, our witness came to the library corridor carrying a heavy tray. Her eyes would not first be at the faces of the company. They would be lowered to keep her balance. March watched him carefully. Meaning? Meaning she may have seen shoes before she saw a face. That struck them all at once. Eleanor drew a breath. And if she recognized the shoes? Precisely. Poirot's eyes shone. A servant notices clothes, gloves, umbrellas, shoes, sometimes far better than faces. Faces do not concern her unless they speak to her. Shoes approach, pause, turn away. Shoes tell stories. Vale murmured, "You propose our entire tragedy may depend on footwear." Poirot inclined his head. Often truth begins at the feet and only later reaches the head. He turned to March. "I should like, if you please, to see the shoes worn by each person last night." Colonel Ashby stared. Now, said Poirot pleasantly, before anyone has time to remember that leather may be altered more easily than memory. There was resistance, of course. Surprise, annoyance, a touch of ridicule. But March backed him firmly, and one by one they submitted. Evening shoes, pumps, polished black Oxfords, satin slippers. The servants were questioned too. Milly herself was brought quietly to the doorway when the collection had been assembled in the library. Poirot did not force her to enter. He merely stood at a slight distance and let her look. At first, she stared without movement. Then her gaze passed over the row once, returned, and fixed. Her face changed. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she lifted one finger. She pointed not at Felix Harmon, but at a pair of elegant black patent shoes with a narrow instep and a silver-edged buckle. The shoes of Cedric Vale. No one moved for several seconds. The pointed finger trembled in the air like the needle of a compass that had at last found its north. Milly stood in the doorway, white-faced, breathing quickly, her eyes fixed not on Cedric Vale himself, but on the shoes lying neatly among the others on the carpet. The certainty of the gesture was more terrible than speech. Vale was the first to recover. "My dear child," he said softly, almost lazily, "that is a very pretty piece of theatre, but hardly conclusive." His tone was admirable. His colour had not altered. Only the smallest tightening at the corners of his mouth betrayed that the blow had landed. So Inspector March stepped at once between him and the door. "No one is accusing you yet, Mr. Vale." "No," said Vale. "One begins to lose the distinctions." Poirot did not take his eyes from Milly. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "you are quite sure?" The girl nodded with sudden violence. "And last night in the corridor, you saw these shoes?" Again she nodded. Poirot inclined his head as though she had answered him in perfect language. "Merci." The housekeeper led her away before the strain could overcome her entirely. As the door closed behind them, the balance in the room shifted palpably. Suspicion, which had until then moved like mist among them all, condensed sharply around a single figure. Vale gave a little sigh and looked down at the incriminated shoes with a faint expression of disdain, as though they had behaved badly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Half the men in London wear patent leather to dinner." "Not," said Poirot quietly, "with that silver edge at the buckle." Vale glanced up at him. "You are observant." "I try to deserve the compliment." March said, "You told us you wandered nowhere. That may require correction." "I told you," said Vale, "that I remained in the library while waiting for Sir Alistair's exhibition. That was true. Were you in the corridor when the maid arrived with the coffee tray?" Vale shrugged. "Possibly for a moment." "A moment doing what?" "Moving about the house like any guest not yet conscious that his evening will be itemized by police." Colonel Ashby gave an exasperated snort. "Why the devil not say so before?" Vale turned his head slightly. "Because, Colonel, I dislike surrendering my movements to men with notebooks when those movements are innocent." "Innocent men generally understand the advantage of clarity," said March. Only in detective fiction, said Vale. Poirot let the exchange die before speaking. Monsieur Vale, let us be exact. Did you approach the safe last night before Sir Alistair opened it? No. Did Millie see you in the corridor? Evidently. Did you see her? I do not remember. Poirot gave a tiny sigh. How many misfortunes are born from selective memory? Vale spread his hands. I admire the line, but I should prefer substance. You shall have it. Poirot crossed slowly to the writing desk and rested his fingertips on its edge. You're an expert in pictures, provenance, acquisition, discreet resales. You knew more than any person here about the vermeulen. So you knew it was disputed, and you knew exactly what it might become worth if returned, suppressed, or privately negotiated. You had opportunity to observe Sir Alistair's safe over any number of visits. And now, the one witness we possess places you near the library corridor at the critical time. Vale's face remained composed. All very graceful. Still, none of it proves I removed the painting. No, said Poirot, not by itself. Adrian Lee, who had been silent for several minutes, spoke with sudden force. Then press him. He knows something. Vale turned to him with a cool smile. You're becoming emotional, Mr. Lee. That does not improve your profile. Lee took a step forward, but Colonel Ashby caught his arm. None of that. Poirot's eyes flickered from one to the other. Yes, he murmured. Emotion. It begins to rise. Lady Wynne said in her level voice, Monsieur Poirot, are we now to endure insinuation all morning? If Mr. Vale has an explanation, let him give it. How admirably direct, said Vale. Very well. I was indeed in the corridor. I'd gone to fetch my cigarette case, which I had left in the morning room. On my way back, I paused outside the library because I heard voices within. That is all. Whose voices? Asked March. Sir Alistair's, certainly. Another person's, perhaps. I did not attend. Male or female? Vale gave the faintest shrug. I truly could not say. Poirot turned his head. Yet you paused? For a moment. Why? Vale's smile thinned. Because in houses like this, monsieur, people are always pausing outside doors. Curiosity is not yet a felony. No, said Poirot. But sometimes it is a profession. Miss Trent, who had been watching Vale with a grave steadiness, spoke at last. Cedric, did you or did you not intend to take the painting? Every head turned. Vale looked at her, and for the first time there was something like annoyance in his expression. My dear Viola, that is rather melodramatic. Answer it. He let the silence stretch a little. No, he said. Poirot glanced at her thoughtfully. You ask with conviction, mademoiselle. Why? She hesitated, then answered with admirable control. Because Cedric had spoken of the picture too often. Because he knew more about its history than he pretended. Because he told me once, only half jokingly, that certain works of art are safer in the hands of thieves than collectors. Vale laughed softly. And you remember my bondsmots only when they are useful against me. I remember them when they stop being amusing. Inspector March stepped closer. Mr. Vale, where were you between leaving the drawing room and Sir Alistair's invitation to view the painting? I have told you. Not fully. I went to the morning room, then to the corridor, then back. Did you meet anyone? Vale hesitated very slightly. No. Poirot noticed it. Ah, there is perhaps one person you do not wish to mention. Vale's eyes cooled. You overestimate your intuition. Do I? Poirot turned without warning to Lady Wynne. Madame, did you meet Monsieur Vale privately last night? The effect of the question was electric. Lady Wynne did not start, but something in her stillness became suddenly deliberate. No. Poirot bowed. Ah, I thank you. Eleanor looked sharply from her aunt to Vale. Miss Trent's eyes narrowed. Harmon, near the bookcase, seemed to withdraw even further into himself. March said, "Why ask that?" Poirot answered mildly, "Because when people lie with perfect grammar, I always become interested." Lady Wynne's gaze hardened. "That is an impertinence." "Possibly," said Poirot, "but not, I think, an error." He walked toward the window and stood looking out for a moment before turning back. "Let us arrange the evening. After dinner there is tension concerning the painting. Sir Alister has already seen the claim papers and is furious. Monsieur Vale is interested in the picture, perhaps professionally, perhaps morally, perhaps both. The secretary is anxious. The niece is openly at odds with her uncle. Others have their own reasons for unease. Then, before the public opening of the safe, something occurs in the library corridor. Milly sees Monsieur Vale there and is terrified. But is it because she sees him stealing? No, I begin to think not." March frowned. "Then what?" "Because," said Poirot, "if she had seen him opening the safe, why try to write H&A? That struck them again. Vale seized on it. "Exactly. Thank you. At last reason." But Poirot lifted one finger. No, do not be too pleased. Those letters still matter. They matter enormously." He crossed to the inspector and held out his hand for the folded sheet. March gave it to him. Poirot opened it and studied the scrawled marks. "Oh, and the beginning of A. We assumed a name. Perhaps it is not a person's name at all. Perhaps it is the beginning of what she wished to tell us. Has, hand." He paused, and his eyes brightened suddenly. "Ah, what is it?" March asked. Poirot looked up. "The position. Last night Miss Wynne said Milly stared not at the body but at someone in the room. Yes? But when a person has just seen a dead man and then sees someone bending above him, what does she notice? Not only the face. The hands." He turned to Eleanor. "Mademoiselle, did anyone kneel first beside Sir Alister?" "Dr. Reeve and Colonel Ashby moved nearly at once," she said. Then others came forward. "Who touched him first?" she thought. "I'm not certain. There was confusion." Poirot nodded slowly. Could she have meant his hand, or hand at... No, not elegant. But perhaps simply that what frightened her in the doorway was not who stood there, but what that person held, or what was on the hand. March said, "You think we have been reading the clue wrongly?" "We have certainly been reading it too greedily." Dr. Bernard Reeve, who had so far remained on the margins of the discussion with the reserve of a medical man reluctant to tread on police ground, now spoke in his measured voice. "If the maid saw someone's hand, what exactly do you suppose she saw?" Poirot turned and regarded him with polite attention. "That, doctor, depends. Was there anything on Sir Alister's body, or on the person nearest him, that would have struck a frightened servant as remarkable?" Reeve looked thoughtful. "Nothing obvious." "Gloves?" asked March abruptly. "No one wore gloves indoors," said Ashby impatiently. Poirot's gaze had not left the doctor. "You examined Sir Alister at once?" "Yes." "You loosened his collar, touched his throat, as his wrist?" "Yes." "And his hands?" Reeve hesitated. "Naturally. A physician looks for discoloration, spasm, signs of seizure." Poirot nodded very gently. "Of course." Something indefinable passed through the room then. It was not accusation, not yet. But the path of attention had shifted. One felt it physically, as one feels a draft when a hidden door opens somewhere in a large house. Reeve was aware of it. His expression remained composed, but his voice sharpened by a degree. "Surely you are not implying—" "My dear doctor," said Poirot, "I imply nothing. I observe only that in a room full of excited people, the man permitted to touch the body freely is always of interest." Inspector March said, "There will be a post-mortem, if there was poison." Reeve interrupted. "There was no sign of poison." Poirot murmured, You are very prompt. The doctor flushed faintly. I said no sign, not no possibility. Excellent. Precision again. Vale gave a low laugh. How quickly one pair of shoes becomes insufficient for the company. Truth, said Poirot, is never content with a single ornament. He then turned back to Vale. Nevertheless, monsieur, we are not finished with you. You were in the corridor. Millie saw you. Why did she then fall silent? Because what she saw placed you near the event, but perhaps not at its center. That is inconvenient for you, but it may save you from a larger mistake. Vale's expression became watchful. And what larger mistake is that? That of confusing theft with murder. No one spoke. Poirot continued, his voice calm and very clear. I think now that there were two designs at work in Blackthorn House last night, and one concerned the painting. The other concerned Sir Alistair Wynne. They crossed, perhaps by chance, perhaps by calculation, and because of that crossing, the only witness could not understand what she had seen. March stared at him. Two separate schemes? Yes. Harmon and Vale. Poirot spread his hands. Possibly, or Vale and another, or one half intention and one fully murderous act, but we must not force the pattern too soon. Lady Wynne said with a chill distinctness, This grows more extravagant by the minute. Poirot turned to her. On the contrary, madame, it grows simpler. Art creates vanity. Vanity breeds secrecy. Secrecy invites theft. And in the midst of that confusion, someone saw an opportunity to kill. He looked from one face to another. Now we must discover who had the courage, or desperation, to seize it. The room had grown unnaturally quiet. It was not the silence of confusion now, but the silence of people who had begun to feel the edges of something closing around them. The suggestion that two separate intentions had collided the previous night. One theft, one murder, hung over the company like a slowly tightening net. Inspector March broke the stillness first. You are saying, he said carefully, that someone planned to steal the painting, and someone else planned to kill Sir Alistair. Yes, said Poirot, and that the two events became entangled. Exactly. March frowned. Then we must separate them. Poirot inclined his head. That is precisely the task. Cedric Vale spoke with a touch of impatience. Well then, let us begin with the painting. But you have already half accused me of that. Poirot turned toward him calmly. I have accused you of proximity, not guilt. Vale spread his hands. I was in the corridor. The maid saw my shoes. That much we accept. But I did not open the safe. Perhaps not. Then who did? Poirot looked toward Harmon. Monsieur Harmon knew the safe might soon lose its contents legally. That creates temptation, but he is not a bold man. His memorandum speaks of discreet intermediaries and careful timing, not of sudden theft. Harmon's jaw tightened. I have already said I did not remove the painting. Yes. Poirot turned slowly toward the others. And there is another possibility. Someone who wished the painting removed quickly, not for profit, but for justice. His eyes came to rest on Eleanor Wynne. For a moment, no one breathed. Eleanor did not flinch. You think I took it, she said quietly. Poirot shook his head gently. No. The tension shifted again. But you wished it returned, he continued. Yes. And you argued openly with your uncle. Yes. But if you had removed it secretly, mademoiselle, you would not have waited for him to discover its absence in public. Eleanor nodded slowly. That is true. Poirot turned his attention back to Vale. You, however, monsieur, might have found such theatre amusing. Vale smiled faintly. I enjoy theatre, but I prefer plots that succeed. Poirot said softly, Perhaps yours did. Vale's eyes sharpened. What do you mean? You removed the painting before dinner. You left the safe closed. You expected Sir Alistair to open it and discover the loss in front of witnesses? Vale said nothing. March watched him closely. Why would he do that? The inspector asked. Poirot answered, because if the painting were stolen publicly, suspicion would scatter everywhere, and because Monsieur Vale might later reintroduce the picture through professional channels. Vale gave a small laugh. That is imaginative. Poirot's eyes glinted. And profitable. For the first time, Vale did not answer at once. March stepped forward. Did you take the painting? Vale looked at him thoughtfully. Inspector, let us suppose I did. That would make me a thief, not a murderer. Unless the theft killed Sir Alistair. Vale shrugged. I did not know he had a weak heart. Poirot said quietly, I believe you. Everyone looked at him. Vale raised his eyebrows. How generous. Poirot continued calmly. Because your plan did not include a corpse. You wished humiliation, confusion, as perhaps negotiation. But not death, March said sharply. Then who killed him? Poirot turned slowly toward Dr. Bernard Reeve. The doctor stood very still. Doctor, said Poirot gently, when Sir Alistair collapsed, you reached him first. Yes. You examined his pulse. Yes. You touched his throat. Yes. And you were the only person in that room with the knowledge and the opportunity to do something very small and very fatal. Reeve's expression hardened. This is absurd. Is it? Poirot took a slow step closer. A doctor knows many things. He knows how to quiet a heart that is already struggling. A slight pressure, a brief obstruction, something so quick that it might easily be mistaken for the natural end of a seizure. March stared. You think he suffocated him? Not exactly. Poirot spoke very softly now. And when Milly looked into the room, she saw the doctor bending over Sir Alistair. She saw his hand. That is what frightened her. Not the face. She already knew the doctor. But the way his hand was placed. Reeve's voice rose sharply. You cannot prove that. Poirot nodded. Perhaps not yet. Then he added quietly. But you had reason. Reeve's eyes flashed. What reason? Poirot answered with careful precision. 3 years ago, a Belgian refugee named Madame Vermeulen died in a clinic in London. She had been under your care. Reeve froze. Poirot continued. She had one surviving relative, her niece in Brussels. The same niece who has been trying to recover the painting. Inspector March's voice was low. You knew the family? Reeve said nothing. Poirot went on. Madame Vermeulen spoke of the painting often, of how it had been taken from her. And of the man who possessed it. He paused. And of the doctor who listened. The silence was suffocating. Eleanor whispered, You mean, he knew who had it? Yes. Reeve's composure finally cracked. You sentimental fool, he snapped. Do you think Sir Alistair would ever have surrendered it? Poirot answered calmly. No. Exactly. He would have fought the claim, buried it in lawyers, laughed at the old woman's suffering. I saw that from the moment I learned the truth. March said grimly. So you decided to kill him? Reeve's breathing had grown uneven. I decided to stop him. With murder. He was already dying. Poirot shook his head slightly. Not yet. Reeve looked around the room, at the shocked faces, the tightening circle of suspicion, the inevitable end of concealment. Vale took the painting, he said suddenly. Vale stared at him. Yes, Reeve continued bitterly. I saw him leave the corridor just before the gathering. I realized what he had done, and when Sir Alistair opened the safe and collapsed, you finished the work, said Poirot quietly. Reeve laughed harshly. One small movement, one moment of pressure. The great Sir Alistair Wynne died of shock. Inspector March stepped forward. Dr. Bernard Reeve, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Alistair Wynne. Constables moved quickly. Reeve did not resist. As they led him away, he said only one thing. He deserved it. The door closed behind them. For a long time no one spoke. Then Vale exhaled slowly. Well, he said softly, That became unexpectedly serious. Inspector March turned to him. "And the painting, Mr. Vale?" Vale gave a faint, resigned smile. "It is in the hollow panel behind the morning room fireplace." March stared. "You hid it here?" "Temporarily." "Why?" Vale shrugged. "I wished to see how the drama developed." Poirot sighed. "Monsieur Vale, you have a dangerous sense of humor." March signaled a constable to retrieve the painting. Eleanor stood quietly beside the window. "It will go back to the family," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "Yes." Outside, the wind moved softly through the beeches. After a moment, Miss Trent said, "2 crimes in one evening." Poirot adjusted his cuffs carefully. "No," he said, "only 1 crime." They looked at him. The theft was merely vanity. The murder was pride. Inspector March glanced toward the corridor where the doctor had been taken. "And the witness?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, as the brave little witness who refused to speak." He looked toward the staircase where Millie had disappeared earlier. "She told us everything, once we learned how to listen." The constable returned within a few minutes, carrying a small object wrapped carefully in a folded cloth. Inspector March unwrapped it on the writing desk, and the room leaned forward almost involuntarily. The painting was smaller than most had imagined. A quiet Dutch interior, a woman seated near a window, pale light falling across a table, the geometry of calm domestic life rendered with such stillness that one almost expected the figure to breathe. Its value was not obvious to the untrained eye, yet once seen it held attention with a subtle authority. "The Vermeulen," murmured Vale. Inspector March looked at him coolly. "You admit it now?" Vale shrugged faintly. "It seems redundant to deny what is sitting on the desk." "Why hide it here?" "I already told you. I intended to move it later. Out of the country. Perhaps. Or perhaps into safer hands. Ownership disputes can be very profitable when properly mediated." Poirot shook his head gently. "Monsieur Vale, you are fortunate that your crime concerns property rather than life. Vanity is rarely punished as severely as pride." Vale gave a soft laugh. "One must specialize." March turned to the constable. "Take it into custody." The painting was wrapped again and removed from the room, leaving behind only the quiet space where it had rested. For a moment, the library seemed suddenly larger. Colonel Ashby drew a slow breath. "Confounded business." Adrian Lee said nothing, but the tension had drained from his posture, and Miss Trent stood near the window, watching the grey light beyond the terrace with a thoughtful expression. Lady Wynne had not moved since the doctor's arrest. Her composure was still remarkable, but something in her stillness had altered. It was not grief exactly. Sir Alister had not been an easy man to mourn, but the collapse of a structure that had seemed immovable. At last she spoke. "So that is the truth." Poirot regarded her with quiet courtesy. "It is the truth that remained after the illusions were removed." "And you believe that satisfies justice?" "Justice," said Poirot softly, "is rarely satisfied. It is merely arranged." Inspector March closed his notebook. "Dr. Reeve will stand trial. Mr. Vale will answer for the theft. The painting will be returned to its rightful owners." He paused. "That is as much order as the law can provide." Lady Wynne inclined her head once, then turned and left the room without another word. After she had gone, Colonel Ashby muttered under his breath, "Hell of a way for a house party to end." "Many house parties," said Poirot gently, "end with unpleasant discoveries. Only rarely are they so instructive." Miss Trent turned toward him. "You knew earlier than you admitted." Poirot smiled faintly. "I suspected." "From the beginning?" "No, from the moment our little witness wrote her letters." "H&A," said Lee. "Yes." He reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper once more. "You see, we all assumed she meant the beginning of a name. But the letters may also begin a phrase." "Which phrase?" asked Ashby. Poirot tapped the page lightly. "Hand at—" They looked at him. Milly saw the doctor's hand at Sir Alister's throat. Poirot said quietly. Inspector March nodded slowly, and the shock of seeing that froze her voice. "Yes," Miss Trent said thoughtfully, yet she pointed to Vale's shoes. "Because that is what she noticed first," Poirot replied. She entered the corridor with her eyes lowered, balancing the tray. She saw the shoes outside the library door, Monsieur Vale lingering there. That frightened her already. But when she looked again inside the room moments later, she saw something far worse. "The doctor," said Eleanor softly. Poirot inclined his head, bent over the body, his hand where it should not have been. They were silent for a while. Finally, Inspector March said, "You were right about two designs crossing." "Yes." "The theft and the murder." "Exactly." Vale leaned against the mantel with mild curiosity. "And if I had not taken the painting?" Poirot looked at him. "Then Sir Alister might still be alive." Vale gave a thin smile. "How morally inconvenient." Poirot did not return the smile. Human events often are. At that moment, Eleanor spoke again. "The painting will go back to the Vermeulen family." "Yes," said Poirot. "And Sir Alister's reputation?" Poirot considered that. "Reputation," he said at last, "is the most fragile possession of all. It depends entirely on what the living choose to remember." Inspector March glanced toward the window where the morning had grown brighter. "Well, I have paperwork to begin, statements to take, arrangements to make." He paused at the door. "And Monsieur Poirot, thank you." Poirot bowed slightly. It was a pleasure to assist. March left the room. Colonel Ashby soon followed, grumbling about trains and London obligations. Lee departed more quietly. Vale lingered a moment longer, studying Poirot with amused respect. "You are wasted in Belgium," he said. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary, monsieur, Belgium is very fond of me." Vale laughed softly and went out. At last, only two people remained in the library. Poirot and Eleanor Wynne. She stood near the window, watching the wind move through the trees. "My uncle was not a good man," she said. Poirot did not contradict her, but he did not deserve that. "No." She turned to him. "Will the doctor say he did it for justice?" "Almost certainly." "And will anyone believe him?" "Some will." Eleanor nodded slowly. "So that is what frightens me." Poirot folded his gloves carefully. "There is a great danger in believing that justice belongs to those who feel it most strongly. When that happens, it ceases to be justice at all." She was silent. After a moment, he added gently, "But there is one thing you achieved, mademoiselle." "What?" "You refused to pretend the painting was honestly owned." She looked down. "That hardly seems important now." "On the contrary," said Poirot. "Truth often begins with small refusals." They walked together toward the hall. Near the staircase, they passed Milly, who stood speaking softly with the housekeeper. The girl looked up anxiously as Poirot approached. He removed his hat and bowed to her with grave respect. "You are very brave." She flushed and looked down, still unable to speak. Poirot smiled kindly. "It does not matter. You told the truth perfectly." Outside, the motor car waited on the gravel drive. As Poirot stepped into it, he glanced once more at Blackthorn House standing tall above the autumn lawn. A house built on confidence, now altered forever. He settled back in his seat and adjusted his moustache with precise care. "Human nature," he murmured to himself, "is always the most curious mystery of all." The motor car rolled away down the long drive, leaving the house and its revelations behind.